Good morning, good day, everyone. This is CJ, and I'm here with London Paul, delivering another Sirius report. Very excited. V can't be with us. Hopefully, he can jump on here in a little bit. But I know we have fans that are waiting, so we want to go ahead and get started. And very excited to be here with Paul today, delivering another Sirius report. So, Paul, welcome to Rogue Money. How you doing today?
Yes, well, good morning to you, CJ. Good afternoon and evening to anyone else anywhere in the world who's maybe listening. Yeah, I'm fine. And yourself?
I'm doing great, Paul. I'm doing great. I know we talked a little bit before we went live and everything, and a lot to talk about today. So I know our fans. I know I'm very excited to have you on a show today. So I'll let you. I yield the floor to you, sir.
Yeah, I thought we'd have to mention something about the State of Union address. I don't think we could just skirt over it like it didn't happen. I know you obviously covered it off previously, but when you did the show with all the Rogue Money team, but I think it's worth commenting. I mean, I don't like to get too bogged down in all the platitudes and talk of unity and etc. But I think before we do that, and I might be labouring this point, but we have to talk about this State of Union address in the context of why Trump ever became president. And I know I've said this before, but essentially his role as a president was to take a wrecking ball to the cabal to do nothing more and nothing less. That was why he took on, that was why he agreed to become president. And of course, they tried plan A inside Washington and it just wasn't succeeding. So they went to plan B, where they took the so-called draining the swamp or the deep state or the cabal away from Washington. And obviously now we're sort of at that point where we know there's all the indictments, when they're going to happen. There's a lot of speculation. It's imminent, but I don't deal with timescales, so let's not get bogged down in that. There's certainly international coordination now in terms of personnel and assets they own. We're seeing resignations of people in corporations, politicians deciding not to stand again all over the world. The Clinton Foundation certainly now under the microscope again, and we've said before, the Trump asset seizure executive order has huge implications for many people involved in the swamp, the deep state. So that's the kind of basis for me of when I looked at the State of Union addresses to understand, okay, what exactly is Trump saying here? Because the thing with Trump is he often says things, but what he actually means are two entirely different things. I think you've just joined us, V, so good morning to you.
How are you?
Yeah, I'm fine. How are you?
I'm hanging in there, man. It's great to hear your voice. And, I just jumped on. I know you're talking about Trump and the State of the Union. So by all means, continue.
Yeah, we were just going to start. Yeah, so obviously he declared this kind of a new American moment where he sees America in a very different light. And that's a genuine reflection of what he wants to see in the future. Now, obviously, he's promoted the idea of the US economy and immigration reform and infrastructure spending, and we can talk about it in some detail. Now, I know people get a little bit bent out of shape about the increased military spending. And in reality, yes, the last thing the US really needs to do is increase military spending. The problem is historically, and it's a perverse sort of reflection of the US economy, that when military spending was slashed, the US economy always went into recession.
Correct.
Now, that's part of the rationale behind military spending and the big, huge increase. In the long term, it won't no longer figure in the equation. And I'm not suggesting it's a good idea. I don't personally think it's a great idea. But that's the rationale behind doing that, because it will stimulate the US economy in different ways.
Paul, one of our
Sorry, go on.
One of our colleagues said it best, and this is somebody who's served in that military/intelligence complex. He said, it's kind of like how Reagan did it, where you stimulate the economy via the military spending. The reason for that is, and he made a great point. He said, you got to get this going because this is the way to move the ship. Because you can steer a moving boat, but you got to get the boat moving. And I think this is the way to get that done.
Yeah, I mean yes, exactly. Yeah, that's true. No, I mean there's no doubt. I mean that, although controversially, people will go, well, why spend all the money on military spending? I think the budget was 700 billion when the US is falling apart with its infrastructure. But we'll come on to that in a minute. But and of course, he's reiterated this call for fair and reciprocal trade. Now, there's been a lot of people getting rather bent out of shape because of the fact of all these apparent trade wars that you may conduct with China or may not conduct with China. But in reality, fair and reciprocal trade is going to be the future and how the world will operate. And that's really the basis of what we're going to look at. He also said he's declared that Guantanamo Bay is going to stay open and probably extend it. Well, we know what that's to do with, and it's certainly not to do with terrorism as well. Well, I suppose the deep state are terrorists in terms of what they're planning to do or have done to the United States. But that is the principal reason why it's going to stay open and be extended. Now, he launched the Republican tax plan. Now, we've covered this off in some detail, and he said that it removes the core of the disastrous Obamacare by repealing the individual mandate. Well, yeah, that might be so. Now, there's pluses and minuses, with this tax plan. For example, ExxonMobil have just announced they're going to invest, I think, over a 5-year period, something like $35 billion in the US economy, citing obviously tax reform. The downside is it's going to cause further budget deficits because certainly in the short term, you're not going to stimulate the US economy quick enough. But we'll come on to the economy aspect of things in due course. He talked about bipartisan cooperation. That's absolutely the way all nations will operate in the future. When we get over this idea that political parties will actually have a real difference of opinion and not pretend to, like the Republicans and the Democrats have, and like Labour and Conservative, we have one government and we always have had. So he talked about driving down prescription, drug prices. Great idea. More paid family leave and criminal justice reform. I mean, there are huge reforms that any country in the US, and because we're talking about the State of Union address, certainly needs to deal with those. So does the UK, so does Europe, and so does every other nation. Interestingly, Trump didn't mention the Russia investigation, and well, no reason why he should, and it's better he didn't. Right. Didn't really talk about the climate change thing. He avoided direct criticisms of the FBI, and he didn't talk about gun violence because there was this whole thing where he did an interview with Piers Morgan in the UK, and they talked about the whole sort of gun control thing, and he said, I'm sorry, I'm very pro Second Amendment, and I've got no intention of removing people's rights to have guns, but he avoided talking about that. And at unity, it is platitudes to some extent, but he generally sees where the only way the US is going to work is you're going to have one people, one big American family, and the Democrats and Republicans are going to have to cooperate for the betterment of all US citizens. Well, absolutely true. There needs to be common ground so they can deliver to the people when they're elected to serve. And of course, he praised the military and the police and emergency services and promised to continue to honour and help veterans. Well, all very laudable. And, I'm not criticizing him for saying it, but, it's largely kind of window dressing. He talked about the US economy and, well, yes, the US economy grew by 2.3% in 2017. Well, in reality, it's been in negative growth since 2008, but let's not go too far on that. He said unemployment is at its lowest rate in 17 years and the stock market is soaring. I wish he wouldn't reflect on this because it's very unhelpful.
Correct.
Because in reality, we know that unemployment isn't, because you don't have 100 million economically inactive people. And we all know what's going on with the stock market, and it has nothing to do with real economic performance. The only thing that did sort of slightly bother me was when he made reference to the fact that the economy and the tax reform bill will be the main platform on which Republicans will fight the midterm elections. I don't think that's a good point to fight, because the economy is certainly not going to be in the shape in reality that people think it is now. It'll be even worse by the time you get to the midterm. And the tax reform bill is a big gamble, because how quickly can you stimulate the US economy on that basis? And he's talked about them creating millions of new jobs. Well, yeah, but they're very poorly paid jobs. Mm-hmm. He said that the African American unemployment rate stands at the lowest rate ever recorded. I can't say that's not the case because I don't know. And he said the Hispanic American unemployment rate's the lowest levels in history. I can't question that because I don't know the reality of it. Mm-hmm. Now, we talked about immigration reform and the need that there has to be a compromise, and and he talked about his first priority was helping US citizens, because he said Americans are dreamers. Now, obviously, that's going to create some enemies because people will go, oh, you're just being divisive between American citizens and what are called, the undocumented immigrants. That's not what he's suggesting. And obviously he will. The idea that there's going to be no immigration in the US is nonsense. But, there are going to be certain issues that won't be popular with people. And his plan for immigration has been attacked by all sides, including, the Democrats and the Republicans. But no matter what he says, the Democrats will attack him.
Right.
He says that this immigration is due to a lack, linked immigration leads to a lack of job opportunities for Americans, and wants this merit-based immigration system. Well, a lot of the time it isn't the reason. That's an excuse used in the UK but a lot of the jobs that people who come in who are immigrants, no one else is prepared to do them. So that is not really a reason for a lack of job opportunity. We know that the American economy is in very poor shape. And therefore, on that basis, that's the reality of why there's a lack of job opportunities. It's the same in all Western nations. Now, when he called about this fair and reciprocal trade partnerships, it's kind of interesting because even though we've seen this apparent issue with the Chinese, particularly on trade tariffs, when recently Trump announced a 30% tariff on imported solar panels, what did one of China's largest solar panel manufacturers do? They went, hang on, we're just going to announce plans to open a manufacturing plant in the US.
Yep.
Now it's called Jinko Solar, and they've got the green light from the board of directors to finalize plans for the construction of obviously solar manufacturing facility in the US. Now, by manufacturing products in the US, they can avoid having to pay the new tariffs on goods it sells in the country. So that's a win for the Chinese. Also a win for the US because they'll employ US people in the US, obviously, to do the jobs. So it's a win-win. And undoubtedly, the question is what's going to happen to the US dollar in the future? Well, a weaker US dollar is going to be great for US exports. So whilst you can impose tariffs, if things are done intelligently, it can benefit the Chinese and benefit, in this example, and the US. So we have to be careful when Trump talks hard about these kind of reciprocal and fair trade deals. I think in the end, common sense will prevail, and they're not going to run roughshod over every nation in the process of, because simply they can't afford to do that with China, for example, who is, of course, the US's biggest creditor, as we all know.
Right.
Now, there is a need for the US certainly to fix trade deals and negotiate new ones. There's no doubt the US has suffered as a result of this, although the world's reserve currency is extremely beneficial to them, so the swings and roundabouts in that regard. Now, Trump, interestingly, only mentioned Russia and China when he said they challenge our interests, our economy, and our values. Well, yes, they do, but they're only challenging the existing interest, economy, and values based on a deep state cabal world, which doesn't benefit for the US either. And Trump full well knows by saying that that's exactly what he's referring to.
Yeah. Yeah.
Obviously, he's talked about also the issue of what's going to happen in terms of the Middle East. I mean, this idea still that the US is trying to take credit for removing Daesh or ISIS or whatever you want to call it in Syria and Iraq is largely a nonsense.
That's hilarious.
It is
that's such a fantasy narrative. But you have to say those stupid baby down BS fantasy for the American largesse. The American public at large, because they don't know anything.
Well, no, and I think, part of this is, I mean, there is the realization that, the US has changed some of its policy, not entirely, but for a long time, it was obviously solely there to remove Assad from power and use any Daesh, ISIS, or anyone else to facilitate that aim and ambition. Well, obviously, that's now gone away and it's no longer the case. And it's rather like he's talked about. Trump said they're waging a campaign of pressure on North Korea. Well, yes, they are, but they're doing it with the Chinese and the Russians, and they're not doing it militarily. And because they were warned not to do, as we've said before, or face having their entire fleet sunk in the South China Sea. So there is an acknowledgement in that saying, well, yeah, we're not ignoring what's going on in North Korea. But the rhetoric's very different from what it was some time ago, where the idea was the US would just go in and take no hostages and mete out military action, and that's no longer going to happen. he made some reference again to the US recognition of Jerusalem as Israel's capital and withdrawing aid from nations who, because he said they'll only ensure aid to nations that serve American interests and only goes to friends of America, not enemies of America. But notice at Davos, when he was sat with Netanyahu, how at first he said, well, we're looking at removing aid from Palestine because they're not, if they don't engage in the peace process. But then basically he said at the end of the conversation with Netanyahu, well, we're not even sure you're going to engage in these peace talks either. So he laid the gauntlet out to Israel as well as Palestine, and that's the whole point of it. It's to make these two nations have to grow up, behave like mature adults, and resolve the problems they have. And that's not, I'm apportioning blame any on one side more than the other before anyone starts saying I'm sympathetic to Israel. I'm not being sympathetic to anyone. The point of fact is, it's not about who's to blame. It's about some people sitting down and resolving a long-standing problem in a mature adult way. And that's precisely what Trump is setting out to do, and why he did have a pretty stern go in a very polite way at Netanyahu at Davos. Because I think from Washington's perspective, they don't see, as much as they may castigate Palestine for not showing any initiative with regards to resolving the Palestine-Israel question, they equally don't see Israel showing any inclination to want to resolve the problem either. And of course, you had to have the obligatory, well, Iran's this corrupt dictatorship and we stand with the people of Iran in the struggle for freedom. Well, the struggle for freedom is dissipated given the fact it was a Western-backed struggle for freedom that's pretty much evaporated, and the Iranian people are kind of gone back to normal life, even though most of them weren't even protesting anyway. And there's already signs of some concessions happening, which we said would happen, because Iran will have to modernize like every other country in the world. It's going to have to change how it views things internally as well as internationally. So we are seeing some evidence of that, but certainly there was no big idea that to overthrow the government in Tehran. That was a nonsense. Now, when we come on to this whole idea of rebuilding the US's crumbling infrastructure, well, it was one of his election pledges 12 months ago, and 12 months later we're saying, well, okay, where's the $1.5 trillion, which is probably 3 or 4 trillion, required to rebuild the crumbling infrastructure? Now, it absolutely needs to be rebuilt. It's really the sort of early stages of the US going through the One Belt, One Road, like every other nation does. You've got to have 5-star infrastructure to be able to support such developments and growth and expand out, the manufacturing base across the US. And no point having substandard rail links and then telling people to put foreign investment into the US and the US economy. Now, he's talked about leveraging by partnering with state and local governments, and private sector investment is welcome. Well, yeah, this is all very laudable, but when's it going to come about, and who's going to be the backbone of providing this kind of infrastructure? This kind of investment. Well, either it's going to have to come internationally. Well, I don't see any evidence of people buying up tons of US treasuries, and certainly not to that extent. Or what's the Fed going to do? Print money and the US into oblivion? I don't see that either. But I think we will see common sense prevail, but it's not an easy task. It's like the oil tanker analogy. It's going to be very difficult to turn this around quickly. And the US does need to get this aspect of its economy going a lot faster. I mean, we're 12 months down the line, and we spoke probably 12 months ago going, this is an absolute priority. And 12 months later, it hasn't even really started. But what I was pleased to see is he talked about the need for permits for construction to be slashed. Don't wait years to get this done. Get it done in a year. Well, why wait a year? Why not do it in 6 months? Just, if it's a necessity, if it's urgently required, and provided everyone dots the I's and crosses the T's, then just get building with get the construction aspect of infrastructure in place. Now, he's talked about the American manufacturing base being reinvigorated. I'm not seeing a huge amount of evidence about that as yet, but things like ExxonMobil's a start. Certainly the idea that Chinese companies can come into the US and build plants and invest in the nation and employ people. Well, to some extent that's been going on before Trump was even elected, even during Obama administration days. He didn't really mention climate change, but he talked about that, they've ended the war on what he called beautiful clean coal. Well, it's debatable, but he says, we're very proudly an exporter of energy to the world, well, through shale oil, etc. I mean, the reality is, it's not. I don't know. Climate change is the wrong word. Certainly, the way the world operates and in terms of energy is going to change. Not today, tomorrow, but certainly in the next decade, or probably considerably less. We're going to have less reliance on do now. Cars will probably end up running on ceramic engines, which are so much more energy efficient. They probably 4, 5, 10 times more efficient than current engines in cars and other vehicles. So and at some point, oil and gas will cease to have any relevance. I don't think there's any doubt. So-called free energy for all is something will happen. Not today, tomorrow, but I think within a decade that will be a reality, and it may be considerably less. It all depends on how quickly economies can rotate, because you can't just, as we've said before, say to nations who are heavily dependent on the likes of oil, well, we're just going to stop all that, and your nations can just suck on it, and we don't really care what happens. You just can't do that, because the amount of people who are employed as a result of petrochemical industry is far more than people who just take the get the oil out of the ground or transport the gas. It's a huge industry, as we know, and has far-reaching implications for all economies in across the world, for varying, not just oil producers themselves. But that's something that's further down the track. So all in all, I think probably some of the most interesting comments when he said we're going to remove officials who are not seeking to work in the interest of the US. Well, that exactly goes to the deep state. That's the most unguarded comment you could make in that respect, and that's exactly what part of this plan B is, and draining the swamp, as he said before he was even elected. Obviously, Guantanamo Bay, as we said before, is for that reason. I mean, I think there is a recognition from the Trump administration that there is huge work that needs to be done, and certainly, like a lot of nations in the Western world, it's very broken, it's very divided by divide and conquer tactics the cabals used. I mean, the UK is no different in that regard. I mean, I'm encouraged by what he's saying, but some of it's platitudes, but it's meant with real intent. It's not just paying lip service like other administrations would do when who can forget Obama when he talked about change. And of course, the only change that happened was everything just got progressively worse, and there was no intent to change anything. And how many people fell for that nonsense? Well, those days have gone. Does it mean that Trump's going to be elected a second time? I don't know. And it doesn't really matter, because that's not what his job is. His job was to get rid of the deep state, the cabal, and give the US a chance to rebuild as a strong nation amongst equals. But there are massive, massive challenges that lie ahead. More for the US than anyone else, simply because they had the world's reserve currency, which other nations don't have. Now, there's a huge amount we can talk about in terms of the US economy, and why there are certain issues currently to do with bond markets, etc., that perhaps people aren't aware of, and it's worth talking about. If that's okay, we can just talk a bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Go for it. Right.
Well, the whole point is, as much as the deep state cabal has propped just about everything up, what maybe understand, I don't know whether don't think we've ever talked about this. Well, I certainly haven't, but the cabal's been supporting global bond markets in ways that people perhaps aren't aware of. So the subprime sort of bond market crisis of 2008 is rearing its head again. And we know the Western world bond markets and stock markets are ticking time bombs. And of course, the US is obviously the worst offender. It's got about 600 billion annual trade deficit. And this is where I have problems with the whole sort of tax reforms. Is the new military budget and tax reforms are going to ensure this larger federal deficit this year, barring a miracle in the US economic position, which I don't think the oil tanker can be turned around quickly enough. And we've spoken a long time about all these financial time bombs. We don't need to go on about the fact that the reality of economically inactive people and food stamps or equivalent, high unemployment, enormous debt bubbles, credit cards, etc., and bloated central banks with these toxic balance sheets. And obviously, retail sector is very weak, manufacturing base isn't strong enough, and all the revolving credit has risen back to 2008 levels. That's owned and securitized. You've got pension shortfalls, de-dollarization, which is going to obviously affect the US economy. You've got failing and failed banking system. And then you've got central banks that have been buying US stocks. You've got central banks that have been supporting treasury bonds in order to combat price inflation indicators. But the big, ironically, despite all that, and that's pretty bad, the big risk on the horizon now is the rising long-term bond yields for US treasuries. That's the 10-year. Now, the bond markets was rigged for the 10-year US treasury via the QE bond purchase program. The problem you've got is now we've got rising short-term bond yields combined with rising long-term bond yields, which is happening simultaneously. Now, the fabricated US bond demand came about because of using interest rate swap contracts. They created false bond rallies, and they based on trillions and trillions of dollars of interest rate swaps. Yep. Now, what we've noticed, certainly the 2-year, which is the short-term treasury, has been since September last year. If you look at the profile, it's pretty steep. But even the 10-year now is about 2.7% the yield. And it's on the verge of a breakout. Now, if this yield continues to rise, then we're going to have major problems. Now, the question is, what does the Fed do? Because the Fed's going, we're going to raise interest rate, 4 times this year. I think they're already backing off, because if they raise interest rates again, it'll be the kill shot, not just for the US economy. And everyone says, oh, but the Feds are going to blow up the economy. No, they're not, because the Feds, they wanted to blow up the economy. They would have done it in 2008. They spent the best part of 9 years trying to prevent that. But the US balance sheet's obviously loaded with toxic assets to do with all these bonds. And what's going to happen is if this, I can't say exactly at what point does it get to 3%, does it get to 3.5% if we hit that. But at some point, it's going to cause the S&P and the Dow Jones index will have this massive, vicious correction and decline. Now, what I'm starting to see evidence of, which has never happened as far as I know in US economic history, but perhaps someone will be able to say, well, actually, I've known this to happen before, is we're looking at a situation where US-based stocks, not just uniquely US-based stocks, but in terms of the US, you're going to see US stocks, bonds, and the US dollar all collapsing together. And there'll be nothing to counter that balance. And this is all being caused by QE and zero interest rate policy. And why? It's been the death of the Western economies, and ultimately it's the death of the cabal economically. So the idea that they did this was absolute desperation to keep their game going, but in the process they've destroyed themselves. And we could at some point, maybe this year, I don't know when, but you're starting to see more and more evidence of that, as we say, stocks, bonds, and the US dollar all collapse in unison. There'll be nothing to counteract. Now, that's a pretty vicious circle that there's no escape from my perspective.
Paul, the other thing that people seem to be missing here, last several years, you and I both remember the whole entire, what the Fed was doing with mortgage-backed securities, with MBS, the buying and selling of MBS, how it affected the repurchase order market, and how that was being used to help foster the fraud and propping up the bond market. Now, all of these things are coming due. You got rising interest rates. You have housing about to explode and crash. You have auto loans that are completely underwater. This seems like a perfect storm, and all of this is connected to the U.S. bond market, man.
Yes, no, absolutely. That's why I've mentioned, okay, we put a bit of background as to which, okay, we've talked about in various ways for, excuse me, for some considerable time. But yeah, that currently the bond markets, if the yield keeps rising and there's every reason to suggest it might well do, there's going to come a point where it will just fracture everything. And I'm not one to get drawn on timescales because it's irrelevant, but I think it's likely at some point within this year that this may become an issue. Now, of course, the Feds could back off and go, well, actually, we're going to lower interest rates again, and we're just going to pump, I don't know, $10 trillion of QE into the US economy, and all bets are off as to what's going to happen. But I mean, in terms of their credibility, not that I think that anyone who understands real economics would give the Feds any credibility, but their credibility is going to be shot to bits if they have to do that. But that is another possibility, that they may indeed resort to doing that because they'll have no other option. But all this does is increases the likelihood of the whole thing melting down now. And at some point that is going to happen. Now, as you pointed out, and it's absolutely correct, and we've talked about this before, the stock markets can just keep going higher and higher and higher. It's becoming an irrelevance. It's just a propping up mechanism to give the idea there's nothing wrong with the US economy and it's perfectly strong and it's getting stronger and it's stable. But it's something I don't know why, Trump, I think, should just steer clear of this and not make any reference to rising stock markets, because, there was an interesting, I can't remember exactly, but the last time we had this kind of rise in the stock market, or one time in particular where there was a close correlation, just happened to be in 1929. Well, we know what happened then, don't we?
Oh yeah, it was a wonderful day.
Yeah, and so this is why it just proves, history always has this habit. I think the rise is something that the market rose in 90 odd days in 1929, and something it's nearly the same number of days of these rises that have happened in 2017, 18. So there's this stark correlation, and I'm not, saying that history exactly will repeat itself. Probably likely to be worse than 1929 in that respect. But yeah, it's something that the Trump administration should just not have anything to do. Just don't talk about stock market, and don't big up the US economy, because the US economy isn't strong. It's very weak.
Correct.
As is all Western economies. But I mean, I'm not one for paying too much attention to sort of economic factors and things that in that respect. But I think what's happening with the bond markets is, and it's something we touched on sort of back end of last year, that the bond yields was something that we needed to start paying attention to. And now we're starting to see in we're nearly through the first month of 2018.
Yeah,
that is indeed something that is starting to figure quite prominently in our thinking and understanding as to what's happening. But if we do have that, as you say, kind of a perfect storm of markets, bonds, and the dollar all collapsing at the same time, it's going to be it will make 1929 look like a cakewalk.
Yeah, absolutely, man. I think it's going to make 1929 look like a cakewalk. Some of these talking points, when I was listening to it really is like, I'm like, okay, did Gary Cohn slip that in? But it's that whole Larry Summers emotional economy. You got to get the people emotionally riled up and behind you to get this done. I think, and I could be wrong here, but I think there's a push for that infrastructure spending. I know you were talking about a little bit in the beginning when I jumped on. Do you sense that this infrastructure bill is to get us geared up, modernized, bring us streamlined in a very, very succinct way, that when this global economic reset happens, which it will, folks, it will, that we'd be better positioned to deal with it? I think, is that what you're seeing, Paul?
Yeah, absolutely. The reality is that at some point, the entire world is going to embrace the One Belt, One Road initiative, and not because it's Chinese hegemony.
Amen.
The US will embrace it because it's going to be the best thing that has ever happened to the United States economy, and Trump knows this. And this is the other thing, is that part of it's not a deal, but part of the understanding is from the Trump perspective is the US gets rid of the deep state, the cabal, drains the swamp. Russia and China will work with the US in very innovative ways to regenerate the US economy and bring the US back to being a strong nation amongst equals. That is an undertaking that China and Russia will do. But you're absolutely right. And we've said this, the key thing is when you have five-star infrastructure across the US, it's going to make manufacturing and stimulating the US economy so much easier. The problem you have at the moment is it's a bit like me saying, well, I'm going to put this plant in, I don't know, wherever it might be in the US. And then you go, well, where's the infrastructure to support it? I'm going to have an export market. Where am I going to export this to? Yeah, okay, you may have an internal market that needs to be satisfied in the US, but you want to export, and because at the end of the day, that's the basis of any strong economy, is you've got to have a good, strong export market, which is obviously one of the big failings the US has had, the UK and other Western nations, maybe Germany aside, but that's a separate matter. But that is what's required. Where is the infrastructure to support putting all these businesses and invigorating the US economy? Because certainly when the cabal's gone in entirety, which is going to happen, there is going to be a huge drive for new industry, new growth in sectors that have been suppressed. Also, there's going to be huge entrepreneurship and the idea that they want everybody to participate. There's a lot of great people in every nation in the world who've never been given these opportunities. So you start to put these minds to good work and they can come up with some fantastic solutions and fantastic developments, which will be hugely beneficial to nations like the US and the UK, but on a far wider scale than that. So yeah, it's absolutely critical. And the biggest problem you've had is it's like a chicken and egg situation, because the world knows, or the Russia, China know, that the US needs all this infrastructure spending to reinvigorate the US economy and get it going forward. But there needed to be an understanding that they weren't going to, all this investment and assistance wasn't going to happen while the cabal was still notionally strutting around and in charge of things. The second they're no longer in charge of anything and they've gone, then you will see China be able to work, first off, particularly Russia with the US, because we're not going to have all this Russophobic nonsense about it anymore, where it's, oh, we can't work with the Russians. It's a bit like Davos. The Russians were laughing because the US contingent were doing everything to avoid the Russians. Why? Because they're terrified. If I'm seen talking to the Russians next week, it's going to be on, in the mainstream media that I'm an agent for Russia, and it's going to finish my career or finish me in the US. That's how fearful people are. But that nonsense will all dissipate and go away. And then nations can work together and help to reinvigorate and stimulate the US economy, which is going to be like the One Belt, One Road. It's going to be great for the US, but great for other nations working with them. But there is that sort of critical tipping point which we have to reach before, because why would any nation want to commit, which actually may aid the cabal, the deep state, in terms of their ability to hang on to power? They're not going to do that. So unfortunately, it's a very sort of dicey kind of balancing or difficult balancing act, because at what point do you start to invest in the US economy? Because the last thing the US needs is to fall flat on its face and not have this process, already underway. I suspect the risk is that might end up happening, but there's going to be short-term pain to varying degrees in all nations that have been afflicted by the cabal deep state. But at some point, and we're talking, not a matter of a year, maybe 3, 4, 5 years. I think the world in 5 years' time will probably have reached a pretty decent equilibrium where nations will have the cabal will be long gone. Nations will be starting to get on their feet, and the new world will be sort of unfolding, and it'll be a very, very different place. But it's going to be difficult until then. There's no easy answer to this. And just because the cabal have gone isn't going to make the US economy suddenly revitalize overnight. It's a long process. But yeah, the infrastructure is a critical aspect. And because it's the one thing that, if I had a business and I'm looking to open up some factories or in the US, the first thing I'm going to say is, okay, well, if I want an export market, how am I going to export? Where am I going to put this business? Where's the rail links? Where's the road links? Where's the infrastructure to support my business? Where's the report that I can export my goods to whoever in the world, be it on the West Coast, the East Coast, anywhere else? These are all considerations that every nation's looking at. Now, some businesses, it's easier than others to do this, but still it's going to be an important consideration. And once the US has, a 5-star infrastructure to support the nation, who isn't going to want to invest in the US? There'll be people queuing up to invest and to be part of the rebirth and the regrowth of the US, in every way, not just economically, but basically building a broken nation that is being broken by the cabal, rather like the UK is a broken nation to varying degrees, and maybe not quite as bad as the US, because the US is basically become far more of a broken nation simply because it has the world's reserve currency. That's a huge price you pay when it all goes, pear-shaped and due south. But yeah, it's very much why Trump made that a big point about his speech. He knows full well that's what's needed, but I'm not as enthused that it will happen as soon as we think. But I think if it does, if China suddenly turn around and put massive investment into the US, you can kind of bet your bottom dollar, pardon the pun, that the big changes are happening. But certainly in terms of draining the swamp, I think we'll see some significant changes. And maybe, the Pfizer memo is one example that when that is released, it's going to wake up a lot of people in the US and further afield who are going to say, hang on, so this is what is actually being going on in my country. These kind of things are kind of monumental moments in history where people look back and go, that was a big catalyst for waking a nation of people up and beyond, because certainly it's going to be in the Western media, it'll be in the UK news, and people are going to read it and say, well, hang on, does that go on in my country as well? Is that actually happening? And, it's the thin end of the wedge, effectively. And that's why there's been so much fear about it coming out. And when you've got the likes of CNN saying this is explosive, there's a recognition it will be. I mean, we'll see what happens. Although the thing is, Trump doesn't even need to, if Trump doesn't do anything, it'll still be released to the public. So, but, I think it will be a very big defining moment in terms of broadening people's understanding. And do you know what? There might be aspects when we read it and understand it where even all of us, you and me and everyone listening, will go, well, we were never aware of that. I mean, don't be surprised if we're surprised as well.
Yeah. Paul, we're at the end of the show. What don't you give out your closing comments as well as your website, any social media you have, and how people could follow you? Go ahead, sir.
Well, first off, thank you. As ever, it's a real pleasure to be on every week, or well, not because we haven't been on the last couple of weeks, but so we thank you very much for that. You've given us great lot of exposure, and the website's the SiriusReport.com. That's SIRIUS. We have the subscription service, which is $4.75. We haven't put the price up at all in 12 months. We want to keep it cheap because we want to encourage more people on that basis. And actually, we did the X22 recently and got quite a big substantial increase in subscribers. So
awesome.
Grateful for that. And we'd encourage people to subscribe. We think it's extremely cheap, and we're very committed to it. We do 5 podcasts a week, roughly 10 to 15 minutes, and it's all current and relevant information as to what's going on. And obviously there's the Facebook group, which is the Sirius Report, and the Twitter page, which is obviously at the Sirius Report. And again, thanks for everything. We appreciate being on Rogue Money. We've been doing it for a year, and it's a real pleasure to do it whenever we come on.
Absolutely. We love having you on, Paul. There's no doubt about that. You're an absolute wellspring of knowledge and information, especially some needed sanity in the insane world that we're living in. So, folks, again, for less than a price of a latte at Starbucks per month, you're going to get a daily intelligence briefing from Paul, which is absolutely priceless. You want to get the inside track on what's happening geostrategically, there's no better place. And folks, I told you this so many times. You can count on one hand how many people and how many websites bring it to you like the way we do. And London Paul is hands down one of the best. I value his information. You should as well. Do not treat it lightly. Treat it as an investment, because it is. And I've talked to people who've listened to bits of information just like Paul and the things that he's put out, and they have done well in terms of their decision making of where they want to move their assets, what they want to invest into. different horizons they're looking into. For $4.75, you're getting briefings that Fortune 100 companies and private think tanks would pay thousands of dollars for. Take advantage of it. Go to thesiriusreport.com and sign up today. With that being said, we're done here, CJ.